Finally, a lot of questions. Now we get all the answers from our Reporters Roundtable. Rajiv Chandrasekaran, the national editor of the Washington Post, author of Little America, The War Within the War for Afghanistan, plus the national editor of the Cook Political Report, Amy Walter, and our own John Dickerson, back after some post-campaign vacation time. Well, Rajiv, you heard John McCain, you heard Joe Manchin, you heard Stanley McChrystal, kind of three different points of view on Afghanistan. I think one thing that seems certain here, we're getting ready to leave Afghanistan. I mean, that's the bottom line here.
We most certainly are. And there's going to be a very substantial reduction in forces this year. The president made that all but clear in his remarks with the President Karzai last week. And I think we're going to have a very small follow-on force there in 2015 and beyond. But Bob, you know, Washington is so obsessed with this number. Is it going to be 2,500? Is it going to be 5,000? Is it going to be what the military wants, which I hear from my sources is around 12,000? You know, ultimately, the difference between 3,000 and 6,000 isn't going to be all that great. The more important issue is actually one of money, which is something this town likes to debate a lot about. You know, as we reduce forces, Afghanistan is still going to need $4 billion a year to sustain its army and its police force. You know, think back to the days when the Soviets withdrew. You know, the communist-backed government in Kabul didn't fall overnight, Bob. It didn't even fall a year later. It fell 2 years later when the Soviet Union collapsed and could no longer pay bills in Kabul.
Well, let me just ask you the question I ask all of them here. If the Taliban or if Al-Qaeda, what's left of it, if they have a safe haven in Pakistan, what difference does it make in just for U.S. security? What happens in Afghanistan?
Well, look, that safe haven potentially could lead to future attacks around the world. Now, we can control those safe havens, I believe, with a very modest presence of special operations forces and intelligence agents and drones in the sky. You don't need thousands and thousands there. But what Afghanistan does need is money to support its army. And with fewer troops there, is there going to be political support in this country to write those checks? And that's a big question mark.
All right. Let's shift to matters back here at home. Money. We've got the debt ceiling argument coming up here. The government's going to run out of money at the end of February if something isn't done. What do you think, Amy? Are we going to see more of the same, what we saw during this fiscal cliff fiasco,
seems that way.
Or is there something better on the horizon?
Wouldn't that be great if I could say yes, Bob? Yeah. But I can't say yes. I mean, I think, remember when the election ended and it looked like this was going to be an era of compromise? Remember John Boehner came out and said, of course we want to work with the president. The president said, of course we want to work with Republicans. That was shattered within about 20 minutes after both men said that. And so I don't think we're looking at compromise anymore. It's really about who can get their way by trying to intimidate the other side more. So Democrats, not the president, but other Democrats saying, hey, here's a way to not compromise. We're just going to print a coin, $1 trillion coin, and that's going to cover it. Republicans now saying, including many who we think of as sort of establishment Republicans, saying, how about a partial shutdown of the government to get what we want? So we're not looking at all about compromise. It now seems like one side is just going to say, if we try to scare you enough, you'll bend to our will.
Well, and in keeping with that, I mean, so we had the fiscal cliff, we remember the end of it. Now we have three mini little fights. We have a fight over the debt ceiling, we have a fight over the sequester, those across-the-board cuts, and then we have a fight on funding the government coming in March. So we now have three big fights, and the behavior in the White House is really interesting on the debt ceiling. Usually in these fights they say, we're not going to negotiate with ourselves in public, but that suggests they will negotiate with somebody in private. Now they're saying on the debt ceiling, we're not even going to pick up the phone when the Republicans call. And that's why when they've said, we're not going to mint a $1 trillion coin, we're not going to use the 14th Amendment to have the president do something to avert this real serious problem with the debt ceiling, they don't agree with either of those two approaches because those approaches have a role for the president. And they say the president has no role here. It's all Congress dealing with bills spending they've already done. That's a difference in posture.
Do you think that the big fight is going to be over whether to raise the debt ceiling, or will it be over the so-called sequester, and that is to stave off these horrendous, these gargantuan cuts in defense and social programs?
I think probably the sequester, although there's a big fight among Republicans about this because the debt ceiling is more powerful because the pain if we blow the debt ceiling is real. And so the idea of some Republicans is because the pain is so big, it'll get the White House to
What would be the impact on the Defense Department, Rajiv, if those cuts go into effect?
You know what it does? It takes us back to levels of defense spending that we had in 2006 and 7. Really, it's far more than we were spending 2001. Yes, there'll be jobs furloughed. There will be weapon systems that we won't be able to procure. But ultimately, the Defense Department can continue doing what it does as its core mission. And I see if Chuck Hagel is confirmed as Secretary of Defense, he's going to be pushing for a new series of cuts, I believe, that will take us down this sort of path. He feels the Defense Department is too bloated, and ultimately the path to fiscal health in this country has to involve further reductions to our military. We saw peace dividends after the Cold War. If we're pulling our troops out of Afghanistan, we're out of Iraq. We've got new approaches to contain Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations with drones, with special forces activity, then perhaps it's time to start looking at right-sizing the defense budget.
Well, do you think Chuck Hagel is going to be confirmed? Obviously, there's going to be a real fight here, but
I think it's going to be a nasty fight. I think a lot of mud will be slung by his former colleagues in the Senate. In fact, and many non-former colleagues. He's facing a Senate where many of those voting for him were not people he served with, newcomers to that body. But I think ultimately he will get the necessary Democratic support, and that from a handful of Republicans to get confirmed.
Agree. Yeah, and it sounds even, folks that I'm talking to suggest that it actually could be a bigger number than we're even talking about right now, that the momentum is behind him. I think you saw with Senator McCain, while he had some critical things to say about him, he was not certainly putting his fist on the table saying, this will not happen under my watch. He said, I'm not going to confirm him.
John, can you recall a time when every single nominee that the president has nominated, there's been this immediate opposition from the other party?
That's the new world we live in now. Although, as you pointed out, Senator Kerry is likely to have a pretty easy sledding. It'll be interesting to see how much they beat up on Kerry for his opposition to the Iraq surge and how much they beat up on Hagel, who had essentially the same position about the Iraq surge. How much of it really is there are a lot of fights that Republicans have been itching to have about Iraq, about Iran, about Israel, that they've been looking for an opportunity to have. They tried to have it over Benghazi with Susan Rice. They kind of basically did have it there, but there's a lot of argumentation that needs to be aired, and it'll probably all happen in the Hagel nomination.
When John Kerry ran for president, there didn't seem to be all this overwhelming support from Republicans about his war record. Here was a guy who had been a Vietnam vet and all of that, but there seemed to be a different take on.
But for Hagel, it's that he, as a Republican, is going against Republican orthodoxy, right? I mean, it would be in the same. It's almost as if he switched parties, and they're now asking Republicans to go and support him. And also, when you think about Vietnam and service, we have many new people in the Senate who didn't serve with Hagel, but less than half of the people currently in the United States Senate weren't even old enough, or they're female, to be drafted in Vietnam. So this is a very new generation. They don't look at that service in Vietnam in the same way that maybe a different generation would have.
I was interested, the president, in selling Hagel, used a little of the ghosts of Vietnam and basically saying, here's a representative of the enlisted man, and arguing that anybody who is going to knock him better have served themselves to have standing to even be in the conversation. I thought twice the president, in introducing Hagel, basically said he's working for the enlisted man, and I thought that was an interesting way to try and preload the argument for Hagel as a man. Another interesting thing about it is when Obama came into office, he told the Pentagon, I'm going to kind of parallel park my way into existing policy. I'm not going to do a lot of crazy new things. Chuck Hagel is a pick of the new Obama doctrine, whatever it may be, but Hagel, Kerry, Brennan, they're all Obama. This is the real Obama doctrine to the extent there is one.
One thing you all might not know, I was down in Texas. The Texas papers are all filled with the reports that Kay Bailey Hutchison, the former Republican senator, may be the pick for transportation. We'll be back in a minute.